They say history remembers the victors, but it forgets the sound of the flesh tearing from bone. The brittle cry of a man whose soul has been broken long before his body ever is. On a gray August morning, in 1305, the city of London wore a silence it hadn't known in years, not the silence of peace, but of anticipation. The crowd had gathered at Smithfield like starved crows to a battlefield. They came to watch a man die, not just any man, but William Wallace, the savage rebel, the unyielding ghost of Scotland's defiance. But what they witnessed that day was not justice. It was ritual, ceremony, punishment carved in the old language of pain. He had been captured weeks earlier, betrayed not by sword or siege, but by gold blood money paid to those who feared him more than they loved their land. He was dragged south through England like a trophy, shackled, paraded through towns where children spat and old men averted their gaze. Yet Wallace never lowered his eyes, not once. Even when the guards struck him, even when they starved him, he met their cruelty with a silence more violent than screams. And so, when the gates of London yawned open and the streets choked with the rot of summer heat, Wallace arrived not as a man, but as a symbol. His face was gaunt, his ribs sharp beneath skin stretched to thin. But in his eyes, God help me, I saw it myself there, was fire. Not the fire of rage, but something far more damning. Conviction. The kind that survives torture. The kind that kings fear more than armies. King Edward I, the hammer of the Scots, had not ordered a mere execution. No, he wanted a reckoning. He wanted the myth of William Wallace broken in public view, shattered so thoroughly that no Scot would ever dare whisper his name again. He ordered Wallace to be hanged, drawn, and quartered, a punishment so baroque in its cruelty that even seasoned knights blanched at the thought. It began at dawn. Wallace was stripped naked before the crowd. Chains bound his limbs. He was tied to a wooden hurdle and dragged behind a horse through the cobbled streets. Stones were thrown, rotten vegetables, human waste, even dead animals, all hurled by hands that trembled with excitement. But Wallace did not cry out. He did not beg. He did not blink. I remember a child next to me asking his mother, "Is that the devil?" And she replied, "No, child, that's what happens to men who think they're bigger than kings." They dragged him for miles. His skin peeled raw from the stones, the friction, the heat. Blood pooled behind him like a trail, as though the earth itself was drinking in his martyrdom. At last, the hurdle stopped at Smithfield, where the execution scaffold rose like a wooden altar. And there, under a sun as merciless as any tyrant, Wallace was lifted by the neck and hanged not to death, but near it. The rope tightened. His legs kicked. His face turned the color of ashes. But they cut him down before death could claim him. This was no mercy, it was only the beginning. The crowd leaned in. Mothers shielded their children's eyes, but the children peeked through fingers. They wanted to know how a legend ends. The executioner turned Wallace on his back. He unsheathed a knife, not a soldier's blade, but something crueler, short, serrated, dirty. The man stood over Wallace and announced, "For treason, for murder, for sacrilege, this man is sentenced to be disemboweled and castrated." And then it began. You must understand, this was not done quickly. Every cut was deliberate. Every inch of skin was peeled back like parchment. Wallace's scream did not sound human. It sounded like the air itself tore. But even through the agony, even as the executioner pulled his entrails out before his eyes and showed them to the crowd, Wallace managed to breathe a single word. Freedom. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't even loud. But it carried, somehow, through the screaming wind, through the gasps, through the centuries, and it planted itself in the memory of every soul there. Blood poured from him. The executioner held up Wallace's genitals and threw them into a fire beside the scaffold. A priest wept openly, mouthing prayers that no god seemed to hear. Wallace's body shivered not from cold, but from the slow, humiliating extinguishing of his manhood, his pride, his breath. Still, he lived. They made sure he did, because Edward didn't want Wallace to just die. He wanted him to be arrested, destroy the idea that one man, with no crown, no wealth, no army, could challenge a king and live. But ideas are slippery things. And William Wallace, even as his body betrayed him, became something else that day. Not a man, not a martyr, but a legend so grotesque, so vivid, that even now 700 years later, we still remember the scream. And it had only begun. They say the soul escapes the body when enough pain has been delivered, but William Wallace defied even that. He lingered, suspended somewhere between the realm of flesh and myth. His entrails coiled like snakes upon the scaffold, his vision blurred with the iron taste of his own mortality. And still, he did not beg. Even the execution-era man who had flayed dozens in the name of law paused, glancing at Wallace's face with something like hesitation. Not pity, never pity, but confusion. For how could a man endure such torment and still hold a silence? The crowd had begun to shift. The jeering dulled. A strange reverence settled over the masseuse, for the punishment, but for the punished. Something ancient and tribal stirred among them. They had come for blood, but they had not expected dignity. Wallace's punishment, by decree of the king, was to be etched into memory with a cruelty not seen since the days of Roman crucifixions. After the disembowelment, the next act was colder still. His heart had slowed, but had not ceased. And so they brought forth a brazier of coals, red and hissing, the air around it warping like a fever dream. They pressed hot irons too, his wounds not to cauterize, but to awaken. His body jerked, convulsed, and yet his mouth stayed shut. His lips moved only once more, and though no sound emerged, those closest claimed he spoke the name of his father. Malcolm Wallace had been slain by the English when William was just a boy. Some say the image of his father's lifeless face, thrown to rot on the fields of Loudon Hill, had followed him all his life, had become the compass of his wrath. And now, at the brink of death, it was not Scotland he saw, but the shadow of the man who made him. But Edward was not satisfied with bodily destruction. He demanded obliteration of legacy. And so, once Wallace nearly unconscious, they moved to the final rite, the quartering. His limbs were tied with ropes, taut as wire too, for separate horses, snorting and rearing with the smell of blood in their nostrils. A herald raised a flag. The executioner gave a nod. And then, like thunder, the horses galloped. Have you ever seen a man ripped apart? It is not like a clean butcher's work. The body resists. Tendons stretch, muscles snap like harp strings. Bones dislocate before they break. And in Wallace's case, it took 3 attempts. The first pull only tore his shoulder from its socket. The second severed a thigh. Only on the third charge did the body finally come undone, as if even death itself was reluctant to let him go. The crowd stood still. Some fainted, others wept. And yet even then, the execution was not over. Each quartered limb was taken to a different corner of Britain. Berwick, Perth, and Stirling mounted on spikes as a warning to all who would dream of rebellion. His head, blackened and tarred, was placed atop London Bridge, a grotesque crown over the city that had murdered him. And yet, he became louder in death than he had ever been in life. A fisherman in Berwick claimed to have seen Wallace's severed leg twitch in the wind like a flag. In Stirling, mothers told their children the eyes of Wallace's arm followed traitors in the street. These were not hallucinations. They were echoes, remnants of something the English could not silence. In secret, Scottish monks gathered the pieces, not of his flesh but of his story. They preserved it like sacred text, carried on scrolls, and in the blood-wet whispers passed from father to son. They did not speak of glory. They spoke of the scream. They said it reached the heavens, that even the angels turned away. But let us not be deceived. Wallace was no saint. He had burned villages, slain prisoners, and waged a war that left countless innocents dead. He had been brutal, ruthless, and at times, unmerciful. But in the calculus of history, such sins are forgotten when measured against the size of the crown he dared to defy. The soul of a nation, they say, is born in agony. And in Wallace's death, Scotland had found not just a martyr, but a mirror, a reflection of its fury, its pride, and its undying hunger for freedom. But it came at a price paid in ligaments, in fire, in that final, breathless whisper that was never meant to be heard but that echoes still through the mists of the Highlands. Freedom, it is such a small word, but it took the English 3 hours to kill it, and even then, they failed. In the months that followed Wallace's execution, a strange shadow fell upon the court of Edward Long. The king, once so thunderous in his rule, now walked like a man half swallowed by the grave. His eyes, sharp as daggers in battle, doled into something. Hunted. Servants whispered of his sleepless nights. His chambers were lit until dawn. He demanded incense be burned constantly, not for piety but to drown out a stench only he could smell. They said it was the smell of burned flesh. It began with the dreams. Edward, conqueror of Wales and scourge of Scotland, now trembled before visions he could not command. Every night, as the moon climbed over the battlements of Westminster, he saw William Wallace not as he lived, but as he died, mouth sewn open in silent defiance, eyes hollow, fixed upon the king with a stare that pierced crowns. And in those dreams, Wallace did not speak. He simply stood, unmoving, unblinking, as though to say, I am not finished. Edward had murdered many, but only Wallace followed him into the dark places of his own mind. In Parliament, his temper grew violent. He accused nobles of cowardice, priests of treason, his own son of softness, but all his fury was hollow. It rattled like a dry bone, because he knew deep in the marrow of his war-battered body that Wallace had won something he never could. Immortality. Wallace had no castle, no court, no title. He had ruled no land but the hearts of free men. And yet now, even in pieces, he commanded more loyalty than Edward did in full regalia. The English crown, once radiant upon the king's brow, began to feel heavier, like iron gilt, like a millstone no coronation could lift. In secret, Edward ordered the burning of all surviving records of Wallace's trial. He declared it treason to speak his name north of York. Monks were interrogated, scrolls confiscated, but the story had already slipped into bloodlines, into lullabies, into the mist. In the Highlands, they began to say that when the wind howled through the moors, it was Wallace's breath returning to stir the courage of the living. Farmers claimed their oxen froze in the fields at night, eyes turned toward the hills, as though watching for a phantom rider. In Edinburgh, a soldier swore that a man tall, scarred, and cloaked in shadow appeared at his campfire, and spoke only one sentence before vanishing into the trees. "Tell Edward, I still walk." And in London, Edward's illness grew. His legs swelled. His breath wheezed through cracked lips. He no longer rode into battle, but lay beneath fur blankets, whispering half-sentences to shadows on the wall. His final campaign and attempt to crush Scotland once and for all was marked by strange delays. His army slowed, not by weather, but by superstition. Men deserted, claiming they had seen the ghost of Wallace riding the edge of the woods. Entire battalions claimed to hear Scottish pipes at night, though no piper could be found. Edward cursed them all as fools. But he too heard the music. It came not from across the field, but from within. A dirge played on sinew and gilt, winding through the corridors of his skull. And in the darkest hours, when even his guards dared not enter his chamber, he confessed not to a priest, but to the empty air that he regretted not killing Wallace sooner. Not for mercy, but for fear. Fear that the man had glimpsed something eternal, something no king could destroy. By the spring of 1307, Edward's body was little more than a ruin. His doctors drained fluid from his lungs daily. He coughed blood into cloths embroidered with the Lion of England. And still, he clung to one final obsession: to be buried facing Scotland. Not Rome, not Jerusalem, Scotland. He ordered his bones encased in lead, his sword placed across his chest, and his tomb carved with an inscription that was meant to be defiance. "Here lies Edward, hammered of the Scots." But even the dead do not choose how they are remembered. Because Scotland did not remember Edward as a hammer. It remembered the scream, and it remembered the man who gave it shape. Long after the flesh of Wallace had fed the worms, and Edward's bones had cooled beneath layers of royal dust, the tale did not die. It mutated. It settled into the marrow of a people who had seen their own blood used as ink upon the ledgers of kings, in taverns lit by candle stubs, in cathedrals with broken glass eyes, in the mouths of grandmothers stirring. Their Potts' name endured, not as history, but as warning and prophecy. Scotland had no shortage of warriors, but Wallace had become something else entirely. He had become what a man could become when his body no longer belonged to fear. In the darkened years that followed, his name was outlawed, yet it spread. It was carved onto blades, whispered in prayer, etched into stone behind chapels where the faithful wept not for heaven, but for vengeance. His legend evolved into a mirror that shamed cowards and emboldened rebels. For every lord who bent the knee to English coin, there were 10 who remembered the scaffold and the scream that refused to die. By the time Robert the Bruce took up the banner, the soil itself had changed. It was no longer just land, it was sacred ground, damp with martyrdom. The Highland winds carried Wallace's name like pollain, settling in every crevice of resistance. It was said that on the eve of battle, Bruce knelt alone in his tent and begged not for victory but for Wallace's forgiveness, not for surpassing him, but for surviving him. And when Scotland did finally crush the English in that bloody, chaotic crescendo of steel and mud, no cheer was louder than the one that remembered the man who had not lived to see it. They raised no statues then. They built no altars. They had no need, because Wallace was already buried in the sinews of their rage, in the rhythm of their battle cries, in the lullabies of their children. But perhaps the cruelest ironia, yes, the final twist of the blade is, that England, too, could never forget him. In secret, some English chroniclers admitted a truth too dangerous to publish in their lifetimes, that Wallace, barbarian though he was to them, had shown more kingly resolve on the scaffold than Edward had ever shown on the throne. He had lost everything and, in doing so, had become the one thing Edward never truly was: free. And isn't that the cruel beauty of it? That a man broken into 4 bloody pieces could not be made small. That even in death, especially in death, he became indivisible. The more they tried to carve him apart, the more impossible he became to forget. Each limb nailed to a wall became a chapter, each spike a sermon, each crow that pecked at his remains a witness to something far greater than rebellion, a witness to the idea that there are some things too large for iron to hold. In the end, Wallace's execution did not quell the flame. It fed it. And that fire would burn for centuries, through crowns, through empires, through parchment, and gunpowder and time itself, until a day would come when the very stones of London Bridge would crumble into the Thames, but Wallace's name would still be spoken, perhaps softly, but always with awe, always with fear. And so if you walk the cobbled streets of London, past the tourists and the rain, past the river's sullen breath and the echo of tolling bells, pause, once at the place where his head once hung, not in mourning, but in recognition, because legends do not need graves. They only need a moment of silence, a gust of wind, and one man brave enough to whisper, "I remember."